Who is ready to pimp out their slides for some tricked out presentations? If you remember, probably 15, 20 years ago, there was a show called Pimp My Ride, where they would take these just beat up old cars and bring them to garages and just restore them in really cool ways. And so we're going to do the same thing for presentations. So think about this. The presentations are your ride for ideas and for messages you're trying to get across for people. And too many decks are just clunky or outdated or filled with bullets or just forgettable. So just like cars, we can customize them. And so we've got 6 mods we're going to introduce to really pimp out your slides. And so that in the end, you'll have an engaging, memorable, and persuasive presentations. For each of them, I'll go through sort of what it is, why it's important, how to do it, tips to avoid, and then I'll actually show you some examples of before and after, just like in the show. And bonus result, as you're riding low and slow down the cubicle aisles, you will be the envy of all of your peers. So let's go along on the ride. But first, why do engaging presentations matter? And as project managers, we spend a ton of time presenting, whether it's status or trying to influence senior stakeholders or try to get decisions made. And attention spans are shrinking, and you definitely need to stand out when you're giving a presentation and trying to get your point across. And engaging slides are much better for retention and influence, which is really what we're trying to do with our slides. It builds credibility, right? If you're trying to sell something or convince somebody of something, you want to have a credible presentation and help persuade others and inspire actions. If it's a decision or you're trying to make a recommendation for something, and you want your messages to be unforgettable. So let's talk about the 6 pimped out techniques for our slides. The first is using visuals to explain complex solutions. The second is colors and fonts to highlight key aspects of the message you're trying to get across. The third is metrics, right? If you're trying to convince somebody of something, you want to justify the points with particular metrics and numbers. Demos are a really good way of showing something instead of just telling them, uh, that something's good. Multimedia for sensory variety, you can't just have slides with bullets over and over again. And in certain places, multimedia makes a ton of sense. And then finally, you want to organize your content into logical groupings and not just have a dump of bullets. So let's go into it. The first one is visuals, and that's replacing just text heavy slides with diagrams or infographics. They simplify complexity, especially if you have something that's really complex and you're trying to explain it to somebody. Don't list all the bullets. You want to simplify it, and the visuals help people to sort of process that information. And that maybe that's process flows or icons. AI is really good at taking complex things and breaking them down simply, so you might want to use that for to help inspire the ideas or even draw the pictures themselves. But I would avoid overcrowded graphics or stock photos or really small diagrams where people get lost in what's actually happening. And so, in this pimped out technique, think about this as custom rims, right? So they're visuals that shine, but still fit the ride. So here's an example, and I just took a 10-step process for how to create a YouTube channel on the left. And you can see there's a bunch of bullets and there's sub bullets and there's just a lot going on. And on the right is a much simpler process flow that sort of you can trace along and you can bring people along the journey. So you could just see the right is much more appealing. It stands out. I'm not lost in the bullets and so on. Technique number 2 is colors and fonts. I'm a big fan of this, especially when you have a decent amount of content, and that's the strategic use of those elements to guide attention. So, you're not making a rainbow palette, it's strategic use. You want to be targeted with when you use them. And they emphasize differences, and they also make the slides more scannable. Certain words might pop out, like the headers here. And that's just using contrast for comparison or bold fonts. You want to be consistent with the colors if at all possible. I'd avoid really bright colors or clashing palettes, right? We have lots of darks and lots of lights, and most companies have sort of a standard color palette. I wouldn't use the gimmicky fonts. Everybody loves that Comic Sans serif font. And in this case, look, it's a sleek paint job on your car. And it's tasteful highlights that pop, right? We're not talking about the crazy flames on the front of your Camaro, but tasteful colors. So before, after, you could see, this is actually a presentation I did on the right, which was whether or not somebody should get their PMP. And on the left are all the bullets, and you can walk somebody through. But on the right, you can see I used colors to say, get it is green, and wait is yellow, and skip it is red. So you can kind of visually just get a sense of what to do there. Just one example. The third technique is about using metrics to justify your points. And this is incorporating numbers or charts or KPIs, things like that, because data builds credibility and persuasive power. So, especially if you're trying to convince somebody of something or you're trying to make a point, metrics are a really good way of doing it rather than just, hey, trust me. And you do that by showing trends or before or after or dashboards, things like that. But you don't want to hand them your entire spreadsheet, right, in small text and overwhelming data dumps. It needs to be targeted for that. And in your pimp upgrade is really, it's a speedometer with clear gauges that tell you sort of how you're tracking in your car. So here's an example. Again, I had done a project management presentation and about saying that projects are becoming more complex, and therefore PMs need to be more consultative, and that they should spend less time doing PM fundamental things. And I double down on that belief, by the way, with AI, and they need to be more soft skills. So on the left, I'm telling you it, and okay, maybe you believe me, maybe you don't. On the right, this is a chart from a survey that I did where you can actually see visually that the fundamentals went from 35 to 24% and the soft skills sort of increased. So just one way of substantiating the point there on the right by using metrics. The fourth technique is demos. So showing instead of just telling somebody with live or recorded demonstrations, especially if you're showing software or you're showing a system. This is a big agile approach because demos make the abstract ideas concrete and it makes it memorable. Now, again, a lot of people like me are visual learners, so actually seeing it is super helpful. And it's short clips and prototypes or walkthroughs. It doesn't have to be this long presentation and clicking on every button. You want to avoid those overly long demos or irrelevant tangents. You want to stay focused on what your customers are interested in learning about. So this is a test drive, right? I'm test driving my pimped out ride so that the audience can get a sense of the product. And so, here's an example. Maybe a vendor has come to us and said, "Oh, we have these PM tools and they're really good and they have lots of features and they increase the effectiveness and it's easy to use." And you're like, "Well, okay, right? Now, very different than let me show you the software. Let me, show you how it works and test it out so that somebody can see for themselves versus just believing the bullets." So similar to demos, you want to use multimedia. And at the right time, you want to add videos or tasteful animation, right? Because it breaks up the monotony and it appeals to senses and it keeps the energy high. It's engaging to hear somebody and watch them speak and it's short clips, maybe audios or transitions. Again, I'm not a big fan of transitions and gimmicky slides, but at the right time, it does make sense. So you want to avoid those distracting gimmicks or any kind of irrelevant media. And this is my sound system in the car. It boosts the vibe without overpowering it, right? We don't need the speakers shaking down the street that you can hear coming. And so similar to the demo example, my software company says, "Oh, our customers love our tools and they say they're great and they think it's easy." Well, that's very different than hearing somebody say it here in the customer testimonial on the right. So you can definitely see the difference. And the final technique is organizing the content into logical groupings. I'm very structured and organized, and I can't stand just a dump of data. So this is about structuring the ideas into categories and then representing them visually. And then improves clarity and memory retention. People can sort of process the different buckets of things versus just a dump of information. And I like to use icons or sections to sort of cluster related points. And if you're paying attention, you saw that I already did it earlier on in this presentation. You want to avoid just tons of text and inconsistent styles or random groupings, right? There has to be a logical meaning for it. And this is your dashboard layout, right? And your front dashboard, right? Everything is easy in place and easy to read so that when you're driving, you can get a sense of what's where. And as I mentioned, I did that before, and I talked about why engaging presentations matter. On the left, I threw them as bullets, and on the right, you can see I grouped them with icons that represent the individual points for a little bit better clarity. So you can definitely see the differences there. So look, here's a bunch of tips too. And yes, by the way, you can see here I'm using two of them. One is grouping and two is uses of color. But you want to keep your slides clean. You don't want to overload people. We didn't talk about this a lot, but I have an entire presentation on why you want to tell a story as opposed to just bullet lists, right? So your presentation should tell a story that sort of leads somebody to your conclusion as opposed to just here's data. You got to know your audience and tailor the tone and details. Some people want details, some people want the punchline, some people want a story and a build up, and understanding your audience. Some people are visual. Understanding is really important. You don't want to use the cheesy clip art, like don't use the little bean guy or the handshake icon or gimmicky animations. It just looks sort of sophomoric, if you will. White space can be used too. You don't have to fill up your entire slide, and white space can be used in a lot of different ways. So just think about the real estate on your slides. And you want to practice the delivery, right? The slides are only half the show. It's all about how you present them. So just a couple of tips to consider. And finally, look, your slides are your ride, right? Make them shine. There's 6 mods you can do to pimp them out, and we went through each of them and when to use them and why to use them and how to use them. I gave some demos of them. Upgrade your deck. It'll upgrade your impact and your credibility. Just make sure you don't have that flashy car. You got a really cool deck, but it doesn't do anything, right? If the car's not driving, then it kind of doesn't matter. So the final message is don't just present, but perform. Uh, Hopefully you have enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it. And thanks for watching.